The American contribution to convoy escort in the Atlantic during this period represents a third point of comparison, and an uncomfortable one. American entry into the war in December 1941 had been followed by a period of catastrophic losses along the US eastern seaboard. Operation Drumbeat, partly because the US Navy had initially resisted the convoy system itself, preferring independent routing and coastal defence. The losses sustained between January and July 1942, approximately 400 vessels in American waters, reflected a tactical doctrine that the British and Canadians had already paid to learn. Restigouche's decision, set against this context, was neither uniquely British nor uniquely Canadian. It was the decision of a specific man, in a specific ship, working within a specific set of constraints that the autumn of 1942 on the North Atlantic had produced. HMCS Restigouche survived the war. She continued on North Atlantic convoy escort duty through 1943 and into 1944, accumulating a record that included further U-boat contacts and the grinding, unremarked work of convoy protection that constituted the vast majority of what the Battle of the Atlantic actually required. She was paid off in June 1945 and subsequently broken up. No part of her survives in a museum, a fact which is true of the majority of the vessels that actually won the Battle of the Atlantic. The broader legacy of the collision decision, the choice to remain rather than withdraw, is not easily separated from the larger question of how the Battle of the Atlantic was finally won. The conventional historical account emphasises technology, improved radar, the closing of the air gap with very long-range aircraft, the breaking of the German naval enigma cipher, the introduction of support groups that could reinforce threatened convoys. All of these factors were real and significant. What the technological account sometimes understates is the cumulative effect of thousands of individual decisions made by officers in damaged ships who chose to stay. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won in a single decisive engagement. It was won in increments, by convoys that got through when they should not have, by escorts that remained on station when the tactical calculus suggested withdrawal, by the steady, unremarked accumulation of correct decisions made under conditions of extreme stress and incomplete information. The turning point, such as it was, came in May 1943, when U-boat losses became unsustainable and Dönitz temporarily withdrew his boats from the North Atlantic. Between the autumn of 1942 and that withdrawal, the margin between success and failure was, by any honest assessment, narrow. Return to that October night in 1942. The swell running. The convoy spread across 8 kilometres of dark water. The sound of the collision transmitted through the hull of Restigouche and up through the soles of every man's feet. Desmond Piers assessed his ship in the way that commanding officers assess damaged ships. Not with sentiment, but with the particular clarity that comes from knowing exactly what the consequences of each possible decision will be. A damaged bow, reduced speed into head seas, a long way from port in either direction. A convoy that needed every escort it had, and which was going to be attacked regardless of what he decided. He stayed. SC-107 lost 15 ships. It is a number that should not be softened. 15 merchant vessels, their cargoes, and the men aboard them went to the bottom of the North Atlantic in the first week of November 1942. It was one of the worst convoy disasters of the entire war. It happened partly because the escort was too thin, partly because the mid-Atlantic air gap was still open, and partly because Dönitz had 17 U-boats in the Veilchen patrol group and the tactical initiative. What is not calculable, what cannot be extracted from the records with any precision, is what SC-107's losses would have been if Restigouche had turned for port, if the screen had been thinner by one vessel, if one more gap had existed in the defensive pattern on the nights when the wolf packs were running. The counterfactual is not available. History does not offer controlled experiments. What is available is the record. A damaged destroyer remained in company. She maintained her station. She prosecuted contacts. She was present on every night of the attack, and on the morning after the last attack when 37 merchant vessels were still afloat and still moving east. 15 ships lost, 37 ships saved, by a vessel that should, by any reasonable tactical assessment, have already been in port. That is the arithmetic of the North Atlantic, and that arithmetic, repeated across hundreds of convoys, and thousands of individual decisions across 6 years of war is what the Battle of the Atlantic actually was. Not a victory, a refusal to lose. The North Atlantic, October 18th, 1942. The convoy designation is SC-107. 52 merchant vessels strung across 8 kilometres of grey water, bound for Britain from Halifax, Nova Scotia, carrying the fuel, food, and raw material upon which an entire war effort depends. The weather has been building for 3 days. The sea is running in long, dark swells that lift the laden merchant ships and drop them again with a weight that loosens cargo and exhausts men. Visibility is poor. The escort is thin. On the bridge of HMCS Restigouche, a river-class destroyer operating as part of the convoy's close escort, the officer of the watch is doing what officers of the watch do in bad weather on the North Atlantic. He is managing a dozen problems simultaneously whilst trying not to add a 13th. The convoy commodore has signalled a course change. The merchant ships are adjusting. In the darkness and the swell, with stations imperfectly held and distances poorly judged, 2 vessels are moving toward the same point in the water at the same time. The collision, when it comes, is not the catastrophic, grinding destruction of popular imagination. It is something more bureaucratic than that. A hard, shuddering impact transmitted through both hulls simultaneously, a sound like a large building falling over in the next street, and then the immediate, exhausting business of damage assessment, flooding control, and the question that every convoy escort commander dreads above almost any other: can this ship still fight? What happens next? What Restigouche does, what her captain decides, and what that decision costs and saves, is a story about the specific, grinding, unromantic heroism of convoy escort work. And it matters because the Battle of the Atlantic was not won by dramatic individual actions alone. It was won, convoy by convoy, by ships that should have turned for port and didn't. To understand the weight of that decision, you have to understand what the convoy system was carrying by October 1942 and what it was carrying it against. Britain, in the autumn of 1942, was a nation whose survival was arithmetical. The import figures told the story with merciless clarity. In 1939, Britain had imported approximately 55 million tonnes of goods annually. By 1941, that figure had fallen to 30 million tonnes. By the end of 1942, the Ministry of War Transport's internal estimates suggested that imports were running at barely 23 million tonnes per year, less than half the pre-war figure, and dangerously close to the threshold below which the war effort could not be sustained. Fuel reserves at certain points fell to weeks rather than months. Bread rationing, which had not been imposed during the First World War, was under active discussion. Against this, Admiral Karl Dönitz was deploying his U-boat arm with increasing sophistication. The Wolfpack system, Rudeltaktik, had been refined through 2 years of operational experience. The U-boats were no longer simply hunting independently along known shipping lanes. They were being vectored onto convoys by long-range Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor aircraft, acting as scouts, coordinated by radio through Dönitz's operations centre at Lorient, and directed to attack at night on the surface, where the primitive radar sets carried by most escorts in 1942 struggled to distinguish a low submarine conning tower from the surrounding wave clutter. The escort forces available to protect SC-107 were, by the standards of late 1942, not unusual in their inadequacy. Convoy escort had been chronically under-resourced since 1939. The Royal Canadian Navy, which bore an increasing share of the North Atlantic burden, had expanded so rapidly from a pre-war establishment of barely 1,800 men to over 50,000 by 1942 that training had inevitably been compressed. Ships were available, experienced crews were not. The gap between the tactical knowledge required and the tactical knowledge possessed was, in the autumn of 1942, being measured in sunken ships and drowned men. A damaged escort ship in this context was not merely a tactical problem, it was a mathematical one. Remove one vessel from a convoy escort, and the gaps in the screen widen. The U-boats, patient and precise in their operational planning, would find those gaps. They always found the gaps. HMCS Restigouche was a river-class destroyer, built by Vickers Armstrongs at Barrow-in-Furness, and commissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy in June 1938. She displaced 1,390 tonnes fully laden, and measured 98 metres from stem to stern. slightly longer than a modern football pitch. Her two Parsons geared turbines produced 36,000 shaft horsepower and could drive her to a maximum speed of 36 knots in calm water, though the North Atlantic in October rarely offered calm water. She was armed with four 4.7-inch guns, two quadruple torpedo tube mounts, and depth charge equipment comprising two stern racks and two K-gun throwers capable of throwing charges to either beam. Her crew numbered approximately 175 officers and men. Her commanding officer in October 1942 was Lieutenant Commander Desmond Pears, a Royal Canadian Naval Volunteer Reserve officer who had joined Restigouche in July 1941 and had already accumulated more North Atlantic convoy experience than most officers twice his age. Pears was 28 years old. The collision damage Restigouche sustained, the specific details of which vary between the action report and subsequent accounts, a discrepancy that is itself a small but accurate reflection of how convoy battles were recorded, affected her bow. The impact with the merchant vessel had buckled plating in the forward section, opened seams that were admitting water at a manageable but persistent rate, and reduced her effective speed at which she could be driven into head seas without risk of further structural failure. In plain terms, she could still move, she could still fight, but she could not be pushed. The repair calculus in convoy escort work was not complicated, but it was brutal. The nearest port with adequate repair facilities was St. John's, Newfoundland, now several days behind the convoy. The convoy's destination was Liverpool, still more than a week ahead. Between Restigouche and Liverpool lay the Mid-Atlantic air gap, the area beyond the range of land-based aircraft from either side of the ocean, where no air cover was available, and where the U-boats operated with something approaching freedom. Pears assessed his ship, assessed the convoy and chose to stay. What followed in the days after the collision was, by the standards of SC-107's overall fate, a mixed account. The convoy was found by the wolf packs. Between 2 and 7 November 1942, SC-107 lost 15 merchant vessels, one of the heaviest losses sustained by any single convoy during the entire Battle of the Atlantic. The U-boats that found SC-107 were from a patrol group the Germans had designated Veilchen, Violet, and they worked with the coordinated professionalism that Dönitz's training system had by then produced in quantity. Restigouche, operating with her reduced speed capability and damaged bow, maintained her station through the attacks. The surviving records, and the records for individual escort actions during convoy battles, are fragmentary, a consequence of ships fighting continuously for days with little opportunity for formal logging. Credit Restigouche with at least one definitive U-boat attack during the convoy battle, and possibly two. Whether either attack was fatal to the submarine concerned is not established with certainty. What is established is that she remained in company. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The psychological dimension of an escort remaining in station, despite damage, is not easily quantified, but it is not negligible. The merchant navy crews who watched the warships around them were not passive observers of the tactical situation. They understood, with a clarity born of extreme personal risk, what the presence or absence of each escort vessel meant for their individual prospects of survival. A warship that stayed, damaged, reduced, but present, communicated something that no signal lamp message could replicate. The question of what Restigouche's decision represents within the broader context of Allied escort practice in 1942 requires a comparison that is not entirely flattering to any party. The Royal Canadian Navy's rapid expansion had created real capability gaps by the autumn of 1942, gaps that were recognised at the time and documented in the frank assessments exchanged between the RCN and the Royal Navy. A report produced by the Royal Navy's Western Approaches Command in November 1942, the same month as SC-107's mauling, noted specifically that Canadian escort groups, whilst individually brave and often effective, lacked the tactical cohesion and specialist anti-submarine training of their British counterparts. The comparison with British escort practice is instructive. By late 1942, the most experienced British escort groups, Captain Frederick Walker's 36th Escort Group, being the standard against which others were measured, had developed tactical doctrines that allowed them to prosecute submarine contacts with a coordination and persistence that dramatically increased kill rates. Walker's group, operating with 5 to 7 vessels, working as a genuinely integrated tactical unit, achieved results that individual ship actions could not replicate. The difference between Walker's group and a typical mid-Atlantic escort in 1942 was not primarily a matter of equipment. It was training, doctrine, and time.